Hello everyone, welcome back to the YouTube channel. My name is Mike, and today we're continuing having a look at the Ghost in the Trenches history video. Because if you've just come from the Ghost in the Trenches video, you'll know that I didn't particularly know about him. I wasn't particularly familiar with Francis Pegahmagabow. Apologies again if I didn't pronounce that correctly, I'm trying. But yeah, I didn't particularly know who he was, and I was rather ashamed that I didn't actually know who he was, or I didn't really hear much about this individual at all in all my kind of years of studying history. And so today I want to rectify this. I found the Sabaton History video about this event, about this individual, and I'm here to learn. Hopefully you guys are coming along with the journey with me, and today we're going to find out who this man was and why he deserves to be remembered. And here we go.
I'm Indy Nidell.
And I'm Joachim from Sabaton.
And this is Sabaton History.
The modern sniper came from World War I.
And our song, Ghost in the Trenches, is about the greatest sniper of the Great War.
Raid after raid, men charged straight into the fire, laying their lives down for a few feet of ground. It is a costly and destructive tactic. Some men have found out that a single shot can be more efficient than a hail of bullets when directed from a sniper's sight. Like ghosts, they sweep across the trenches with deadly precision.
The modern concept of the sniper, like so many other concepts of modern war, was born during the Great War, more or less from day one in 1914. Now, there had, of course, been soldiers tasked with skillfully taking out the enemy before that. In fact, the English term sharpshooter dates back to the Napoleonic Wars and appears in print for the first time in an article in the Edinburgh Advertiser from 1801. That, in turn, seems to be a literal translation of the German Scharfschütze that dates back to at least 1781. You see, the Bavarians and Austrians of the time are already deploying skilled hunters to take out selected individuals in the enemy line. Given the range and quality of their front-loaded guns and the nature of war being mostly advancing formations over open ground, they're still doing this pretty much in direct sight, though. It's the development of better guns, and more importantly, better scopes, that enables the terrifying sudden death from far, far away by a single shot. And in 1914, the Germans pioneer the improved tactic by, again, employing skilled hunters, but now equipped with strong binoculars and high-precision sights.
Yeah, so apologies as well, just to pause that again. Yeah, so everything that he says here is absolutely right. You had, for a long time, although we think of sniping really coming around in the First World War, as you rightfully said, that's where it kind of became its own thing. For a long time, history has always had individuals tasked who were keen marksmen, who would be tasked with taking out targets of importance. And so it showed their Civil War sniper. You had things, people like that with their long rifles to help them with the range and the accuracy. As he said, the British Army had, you know, if you've ever seen Sharp, for example, or you're familiar with Napoleonic era tactics, you know, the Green Jackets, the riflemen, the 95th Regiment and stuff like that, tasked with their kind of their riflemen, with taking out officers, with taking out NCOs, taking out standard bearers and things like that, who could convey and basically cause as much kind of confusion and disruption on the battlefield as they possibly could. And this was no different going into the Boer War, which is kind of where, although this is where my opinion is kind of where sniping began to take a real root in how efficient it could be. Because when the Second Boer War particularly, when the British met the Boers, they were met with extreme fire, and the Boers' tactic themselves was to take out officers, to take out NCOs, to take out people in order of importance, to try and cause as much disruption in the British ranks as they possibly could. And it's also where we saw the ghillie suit for the first time, the ghillie suit coming from Scottish Gaelic, being that these individuals in Scotland who were gamekeepers, poachers, similar to what you said here with the Austrians and the Germans with their kind of their skilled kind of huntsmen, their marksmen and stuff like this. They took those people from there originally as their kind of scouts, and then they applied them. And in the Second Boer War is when we saw the ghillie suits and stuff like this, which is, if you've ever played things like Call of Duty, for example, or Armour 3, or I've seen films or TV shows where they're covered in kind of what makes them look like Wookiees or swamp monsters, completely blending in with the surroundings. That's what a ghillie suit is, and it was really the First World War again. While it appeared in the Second Boer War for the first time, the First World War is where it really came into its own, and eventually it caught on, and that's where we go today. The British first employed ghillie suits, but then the Germans soon followed, and then, as we know it, every nation adopted it. But as he said, the Germans started deploying these marksmen onto the fields of battle, and again, they was proving extremely effective because you had these human waves and stuff like this, and the snipers didn't really need to do much. They stayed, they waited, whether that be in no man's land or their trenches, like I said in the Ghost of the Trenches actual video, and they would just wait for people to step up on the firing steps to allow people to carry ammunition through. That's when they'd hit them. People standing up and looking over no man's land, that's when they'd hit them. If you've seen All Quiet in the Western Front, for example, that film, or read the book, you'll know that the main character as well, at the very end, I'm about to say a spoiler here, but if you don't like spoilers, then skip ahead like 10 seconds. But at the end of All Quiet in the Western Front, the main character steps up and he gets shot by a sniper. You know, and that's the end of his story. And so sniping was an incredibly stressful time to be in a trench, because one mistake, one thing, when you lift your head slightly a few inches above, suddenly that's it. You're gone. Particularly with your head the only thing doing. And remember, these rifles as well are firing at a caliber where, you know, kind of the thing that tested them was still being able to punch a hole through both sides of a helmet at about 1,000 yards. So these rifles are incredibly powerful weapons themselves, and a helmet isn't going to really do much to protect you. But I'm jumping ahead. Let's see what more. I'm really enjoying this. This is my first Sabaton History video that I've checked out. And yeah, I really like this format.
Although their guns are at first of average quality, ranging effectively roughly 300 meters, they are soon equipped with the Mauser G98 rifle with a 1 kilometer or about 3,000 foot effective range. As hunters, they are not only skilled shots though, but also experts in patiently waiting out their enemy from a camouflaged position. As the war bogs down into the trenches, these killers soon become a feared and very effective threat. At the time, an average German sniper racks up 40 kills before he is unlucky enough to have his position vaguely estimated so he can be eliminated by a barrage of artillery shells coming down on him and anything that happens to be anywhere near him. With a 40-to-1 kill rate, it doesn't take long for the Allies to copy the German tactic, so that most units in the trenches on both sides are accompanied by one or several sharpshooters with long-range guns, precision scopes, trained in the art of camouflage, lightning-fast visual analysis, and extreme gun accuracy. Men that will have to leave the relative safety of the trenches, crawl into no man's land, or even sneak into or behind the enemy lines to deliver death and gather intelligence.
So just quickly there as well, it's an important thing as well that I feel like people need to remember as well. A sniper's job isn't only to kill, but it's also to act as reconnaissance. You know, they have these scopes, they have these binoculars, and very often sometimes, well, particularly more so in modern times as well, a sniper's role necessarily isn't just to kill people. It's in fact more often to watch and to collect information and data and then pass that on to their superiors or their wider kind of support unit to then act on that information. And so that's a nice little tidbit here as well, that, you know, even though we like to think of snipers as these kind of killing machines, very often as well, they were still, even in the First World War, used in that intelligence gathering and that reconnaissance role. But otherwise, yeah, as they said, the Germans started deploying and they used that camouflage and stuff like that. You have some wacky things as well where people would hollow out trees and then move them onto the battlefield, and then, you know, it's a tree has suddenly just appeared in the middle of thing, but people would be stationed in that as a firing position. And as he said, the British would then bring their snipers onto the field, and it's those snipers that would bring their Boer War experience, and that's when they would appear. I think it showed it in this video of people dressed in ghillie suits as that camouflage role. But yeah,
you need a special kind of man to do that kind of work, to have even a remote chance of survival. And Francis Pegahmagabow was exactly the right man for that job. He was indeed remarkable in many ways. To start with, he was a Canadian Aboriginal, which meant that he was treated as a second-class citizen in his own country, or rather, not a citizen at all, as Canada at the time did not grant citizenship to people of tribal native descent. It's unclear on what exact date he was born, but it was sometime around March 8th, 1889, on a reservation now known as Shawanga First Nation. The newborn Francis is discovered next to his dead mother, who has apparently died giving birth to him. He grows up in an adopted family, who are part of the Parry Island Band, now the Wasauksing First Nation. Eventually, he makes his living working on the Great Lakes and as a musician in a band. While a sailor, he's given a small leather pouch as a protective talisman, and the story goes that his belief in its protective powers is what will soon propel him to superhuman feats on the battlefields of France. But when you look at his whole life story and how he seems to have overcome extreme adversity from the very first day of his life, it's more likely that the talisman only reinforced a natural ability to face danger, adventure, and adversity with almost nonchalant resolve. And then the war breaks out. The recruiters of the Canadian Army are not really that keen on enlisting men from the native tribes, even turning away volunteers at times. But Francis has his eyes firmly set on joining the war and enlists immediately. By August 20th, 1914, Francis Pegahmagabow is heading for Valcartier, Quebec, the training base for Canadian soldiers bound for Europe. Soon he's in England, and in February 1915 arrives in France to train trench war tactics in the Ypres salient. Immediately when deployed at the actual front, 2 months later, he's confronted with the first German gas attacks. Now, arriving in the trenches, one of which you see behind me, was by any standards a shocking experience. The constant fear of death from artillery fire, snipers, mines, bombardment from the sky, and then there was the all-out hellish experience of going over the top to face the enemy's wall of gunfire. Most soldiers did what they had to do to survive and follow orders. Many soldiers broke down or were killed before they could even decide what to do. And then there were a few men like Francis Pegahmagabow that seemingly found themselves at home and went far beyond the call of duty at immense personal risk. It turns out that Francis has an uncanny skill of being able to slip through and between the trenches unnoticed. His eyesight is exceptional and his marksmanship is excellent, so he's assigned as the battalion sniper. Now, snipers in this war are also used to run messages between headquarters in divided trenches, gather intelligence close to the enemy line, and carry out other dangerous missions in no man's land. But Pegahmagabow seems to be seeking out immediate personal danger as a thrill. At night, he sneaks into the German trenches to stand silently beside the enemy watch posts, just to slip away again unnoticed. He even enters the sleeping quarters of the German soldiers to cut off pieces of the uniforms they're actually wearing as they sleep. Now let that sink in for a bit. The place he is in is possibly the closest to actual hell on earth that you or anyone can imagine. It's muddy, dirty, loud, and lethal. You're under constant threat from mortars, machine guns, patrols, and defense works. Everywhere around you, there is death and destruction. If you do not succumb to the fighting, chances are you will catch disease in the close, unhygienic quarters. And it is the smell of all of this that stays the longest in the memories of the men who suffered in the trenches. It is the odor of thousands of men living at close quarters. Their feces and urine, rotting food, molding cloth and decaying wood, the smell of sulfur, carbon, saltpeter, and other chemicals from the fighting. And most significantly, the overpowering stench of rotting flesh from the thousands of dead that lay unburied in no man's land. And in this apocalyptic world, Francis navigates silently, unseen and seemingly untouchable. He is truly a ghost in the trenches.
Okay, so first of all, that's insane. The fact that he was able to do this, but also like just when they were speaking about the kind of conditions within the trenches as well, it's bang on the money really. I've been to, again, in France and Belgium, there's a number of trenches that have been kind of kept semi-preserved from the First World War, and you know, although there's only very extremely small sections of them, still walking through them and stuff like that, even still in some of the bunkers, I don't know if this is just my imagination or the fact, but there is strong smells of something, you know, and I've been to some other places where you can have the smell of gas. They kind of what's the word? They kind of manufacture almost and have exhibits and displays of what smells would have been like in the First World War after gas attacks, after artillery bombardments and stuff like this, and this strong, overpowering smell of like sulfur from the guns. And you know, and as he said, you know, the trenches were close to what must have been unimaginable horror. You had people in extremely cramped conditions, living day to day, even when they rotated through the trenches. So you had the frontline trench, then you had second and thirds, and then you kind of had the rest trenches and stuff like that. But still, all of these are relatively still kind of similar type conditions. So it's people crammed together in areas. When the rain comes down, there's no real place for the rain to run off, and so you had trench foot, which is the thing where if your feet are submerged for a long time and can't dry, essentially your skin on your feet begins to rot, and that can cause a myriad of different problems. Somebody that I know who's served in the army for quite a long time, in the British Army, he stated that, you know, the most important thing, you know, people think when you're at war, you know, you're thinking it's your head, it's your torso, that needs to be protected. But he said, no, the most important thing when you're at war is to look after is your feet. And in the First World War, this was what was kind of suffering a huge amount. And then again, that's not to even consider the diseases from stagnant water, the diseases from people just being crammed together, you know, in such conditions with limited hygiene, rats, for example. And of course, that's not to mention the corpses that are littered about everywhere, littered in no man's land. And as I've previously said in some other videos, then the gas attacks as well, you know, the gas not only affecting those in the trenches, but then also still remaining in no man's land, sometimes for days, even in cases a week or two, after it's settled from a particularly deep artillery shell crater. And then again, that's not even talking about the fighting whatsoever, the constant threat of snipers, the constant threat of artillery barrages, which, you know, that's why trenches are dug in that kind of zigzag pattern, is if there's a direct hit, it doesn't kill everybody in the trench. And of course, going over the top, which, you know, it is kind of almost applying kind of 19th century military tactics with 20th century weaponry, as some people have described the First World War. And yet, in the heart of all of this, you have Francis, and I apologise, Pegahmagabow. I am going to get his name right. I apologise. I am trying, though. And I hope that doesn't come across as offensive in me not being able to pronounce his name. But he's in the centre of this. And this is the thing with war. There always seems to be individuals, about one maybe in 100 or 1 in 1,000, that while you have soldiers that can't cope with war, you have soldiers who manage through, but then you have that 1 in 100 or that 1 in 1,000 whose war is almost like their domain. It's where they belong, where they feel at home, or they just don't care, you know. And these are individuals similar to like Mad Jack Churchill or Anton Carton de Vort, which if I can find a video on him, I'd absolutely love to react to him, because he's insane, and he seems to fit right in at this. You know, and creeping into enemies' positions at night and stuff like that, just to watch, just to look at them. You know, that's you know, it seems ridiculous to us, and yet he's actively seeking this out. So I'm really curious to see where his story goes from here.
As 1915 passes into 1916, he continues to restlessly stalk his enemy. His incredible service doesn't go unnoticed. On August 26, 1915, he is promoted to Lance Corporal. Now, that's not an unremarkable thing considering his actions, but it is a remarkable thing when you consider his origins. Remember, back home, he's not even a Canadian citizen. But the war is the great equalizer. Soldiers are rated by their peers and superiors on their courage under fire and their actions in battle. Lance Corporal Francis Pegahmagabow's service is impeccable, and in March 1916, he is recommended for the Distinguished Conduct Medal. He carried messages with great bravery and success during the whole of the action at Ypres, Festubert, and Givenchy. In all his work, he has consistently shown a disregard for danger, and his faithfulness to duty is highly commendable. Although he does not receive this, the second highest award for gallantry in the British Army, he is part of the first group of 78 Canadian soldiers awarded the military medal. He himself believes that he is protected by the spirits, and until the end of 1916, this seems to be true, but eventually, even Francis gets touched by reality. It's a leg wound, that will keep him out of action for many months well into 1917. Most soldiers would welcome this opportunity to stay away from the war for a bit, but Francis is not most soldiers, and he wants back to the front. At first, they will not let him, but he starts a campaign of letter writing to convince his superiors to return him to active duty, and he's back in the front lines by May.
Yeah, so I'll just give that a quick pause there. So I just want to talk about two things real quickly. As he said, most soldiers would welcome the opportunity to kind of get away from the fighting. And indeed, that was kind of something that was endemic in some parts of the trenches as well, where people would deliberately get themselves shot or injured in ways in order to kind of get relief away from the trenches for a time, even if it meant spending months or weeks in hospital. Some people would genuinely do this. You had, I can't remember the exact term that they called it now, but people would essentially sometimes stick their hand above the trench in the hopes that their arm or their hand got shot. That wouldn't kill them, and just so that they could go to a hospital and kind of be pulled off the line, so they could, you know, have some recover, have some place where they feel like they could actually sleep without danger to themselves. And, you know, as well, in the same vein as this, while people were doing this, you also had military officials behind the line as well, extremely kind of suspicious of people with these types of injuries, because they equated, you know, if you deliberately put your hand above the trench and get it shot, they equated that with cowardice. And you had numerous cases where people was actually tried for cowardice and things like that on that kind of similar scale. The second thing that I want to talk about what he just said there as well is, you know, that's the important thing to remember, is by his own government standards, Francis Pegahmagabow, apologies, I am trying to do that. I hope that's not offensive, me trying to pronounce it, but I'm just struggling with the pronunciation. But he isn't actually considered a citizen by his own nation, by his own government. And yet, despite this, he's kind of, you know, he's been promoted, which, you know, is a significant thing, and particularly to a Lance Corporal. For American viewers perhaps watching, it might be somewhat kind of a surprise, but particularly within the British Army rank structure as well, it takes usually a longer time to be promoted, given the size of the relative armed forces, particularly modern day now, American military basically get promoted a lot more often due to the larger size of the American military and the wider rank structure. Whereas in the British Army, and I imagine it would probably be the same in the Canadian military, given the comparable sizes or the smaller sizes of both kind of militaries, that it takes a longer time or a higher achievement necessarily to be promoted to kind of their equivalent levels in America. But the fact is, again, he's doing this as a First Nations. You know, this is utterly significant. The fact that he was recommended for the awards as well, you know, is a telling thing in itself for as to the act they done. And as I need to find out this gentleman's name as well, because I don't know. This is my first Sabaton History video that I'm watching, as I said, but I'm really enjoying the format. But once I find out this gentleman's name, but the fact that you're saying that war is the great equalizer, and that is the case, I'm very fortunate in my position that I've been able to talk to veterans of the Second World War. I've been able to talk to veterans and those that have been to conflict in subsequent conflicts, ranging from the Second World War up until, you know, things like Korea, things like Vietnam, which was really interesting, and the Gulf and subsequent wars kind of in the Middle East, and talking about people and their experiences. And again, people that I've spoken to, that whole idea of discrimination within the ranks doesn't really kind of work, because once you go to war with somebody, that's kind of all that matters. It doesn't matter if they're black, white, Jewish, Christian, whatever. You know, they're alongside you. It's, you know, it's your blood together. You know, you're both shedding the same blood, you're both sharing the same things, you're going through the same kind of sacrifices and kind of conflict as everybody else. It doesn't matter where you come from. All that matters is the man next to you. It doesn't matter who they are. And so kind of that being the great equalizer, I think, is telling, because, you know, I have no doubt in my mind that now that he's alongside kind of the, if you will, like the kind of naturalized, the kind of Canadians descended from kind of the white settlers, if you will, that kind of Canadian, the modern Canadian, I suppose, if you consider. I have no doubt in mind that they consider him an equal alongside him due to his actions. You know, and so, you know, that's a really important and significant thing as well to consider, that he's doing this all the while his government doesn't actually recognise him as a Canadian. But yeah, I just thought I should mention that.
The ghost in the trenches continues haunting the German lines throughout the summer of 1917, and in the fall he fights at Passchendaele. Here he is again commended for his exceptional work maintaining contact with units on the flanks and for guiding lost relief units, earning him his second military medal. But by now, the war is starting to take a toll, even on Francis. Try to imagine it. By now, his short stay in the hospital accepted, he's been fighting more or less constantly for close to 3 years. He has taken sight of hundreds of enemy soldiers through his scope, enlarged enough so that he can see their facial features, maybe even the last light in their eyes just before he kills them with a shot to the head. Surely he did what most soldiers do, justify it to himself with the lives he saved on his own side. Most certainly he must have had a capacity to compartmentalize and objectify the enemy to cope with the killing. Probably he was able to overcome the stress by an unusual love for adrenaline kicks, but for how long can you keep that up? And how long can your body sustain this pressure? The answer for Francis is 3 years. At Christmas time, he is diagnosed with pneumonia and sent into convalescence until May 1918. But he returns to service working through the summer of 1918. By now, he is showing signs of what in 2019 would be called post-traumatic stress disorder. He's becoming insubordinate and gets cited for disciplinary problems. But he continues service over the summer, sniping and running messages at, among others, the Second Battle of Arras, where he earns the second bar on his military medal. This is his commendation. During the operations on August 30th, 1918 at Oryx Trench near Upton Wood, when his company were almost out of ammunition and in danger of being surrounded, this NCO went over the top under heavy machine gun and rifle fire and brought back sufficient ammunition to enable the post to carry on and assist in repulsing heavy enemy counterattacks. But Francis is now more of a ghost of himself than anything else, and by early November, he is sent to England suffering exhaustion psychosis. When only days later the war ends, he is discharged back to Canada.
Yeah, and that's something that you need to remember as well is, you know, the thing that I said earlier as well when he said about what's considered PTSD, they at the time called shell shock. And even at the time, again, there is a kind of a rudimentary understanding of what it is the soldiers are actually experiencing, because I spoke about this in different videos. We think of PTSD really coming from the Second World War, the First World War and onwards, rather. And it's kind of hard to know about when was PTSD invented, if you will, because there are certainly accounts of PTSD happening, or what we would consider PTSD happening in history, in Waterloo. I strongly recommend a book written by Robert Kershaw called 24 Hours at Waterloo, and in it it's collected of memoirs and diary entries by both British, Prussian, French and kind of the British allies at Waterloo, and their kind of experiences or their reports or their memoirs that they wrote either at the time in their reports or their diaries and stuff like this. And there is numerous accounts of soldiers there who exhibit things of what we would now consider post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly after the battle, where they keep seeing the faces of people that they couldn't save or the people that they killed themselves. And you know, some of these people wouldn't kind of cope with this. There was one man, I'm trying to remember his name, and I will try and correct this either in the comments or in the description if I can recall his name, but he was posted at La Haye-Sainte at the Battle of Waterloo, and when the French actually kind of forced their way into the courtyard, he led the kind of the repulse, the counter-attack to force the French back out, and in doing so they barred the gate against the French. However, he said, but in that action, in that ferocious hand-to-hand fighting that he was part of, even though he survived Waterloo for the rest of his life, he could not close a door. You know, let that sink in. For his actions at Waterloo, although he survived, the act of him barring that gate against the French and the things that he had to do in order to bar that gate against the French for the rest of his life, and he went on to live a number of decades after that, he couldn't bear to close a door by himself, or he couldn't bear to be around closed doors because it reminded him what he had to do. And, you know, whether that goes back to antiquity is another story altogether. But particularly with a sniper, as they said, you know, it's not necessarily something like artillery firing. Artillery firing caused the most amount of casualties necessarily in the First World War. But there's a lot different thing to be firing artillery from miles away and not being able to see the destruction. little more, I suppose, to an extent of firing a rifle blindly at kind of muzzle flashes or this inherent blob of human beings that you can't really differentiate individual from individual. But a sniper, when you're so close, when you have that scope in order to be able to see who you're hitting, you know, their facial structures, what they look like, that must have some sort of toll mentally on you, because again, it's a thing that we need to remember as well, is taking another human being's life isn't normal. It's not something that we inherently do. Perhaps in antiquity, when violence was more common, perhaps that wouldn't be a thing, and that's why we kind of have less kind of resources talking about that type of thing. However, you know, looking at 20th century, which is where the First World War is taking place, for the average person, society isn't as violent as it was. And so the concept of being able to see who you're shooting, you know, hundreds of times, that has to take some sort of mental toll on your body. And certainly not on your body, but on your mind. And so I'm hoping that they'll see that he had some sort of recovery, and let's see where this takes us.
He ends the First World War as one of only 37 Canadian soldiers to receive 2 bars on his military medal, and is the most highly decorated Aboriginal soldier in Canadian history. He is credited with 378 sniper kills, which is more than anyone else from any country in the First World War, and he captured over 300 prisoners. Numbers that make it easy to understand that, like every man and woman who served at or near the front, he returns changed forever. But true to his nature, Francis, although changed, is not broken. He has experienced acceptance as an equal from men serving by his side in battle, and then returns to Canada, where he is everything but equal. He begins a lifelong struggle for full citizenship and equal rights for Aboriginal Canadians. He serves 2 tenures as chief of the Parry Island Band, and continues his involvement with the armed forces by joining the local militia regiment, the 23rd Pioneers, where he serves as company sergeant major from 1930 to 1936. Francis Pegahmagabow dies August 5th, 1952, and is buried on the Wasauksing First Nation, close to where he was born. Like many of the rest of his generation, he took the suffering of war that he had endured and inflicted and turned it towards changing the world to the better. Born a non-desirable orphan, he is today, 100 years after his service, recognized in Canada as an important part of Canadian military history, with the 3rd Canadian Ranger Patrol Group named in honor of Corporal Francis Pegahmagabow. To his allies, he was a hero and at times a savior. To his enemies, he was swift death. To all of us, he should be an example of how terribly personal war is.
And now over to our roving reporters Indy Nidell and Joachim from Sabaton at Verdun.
Okay, so just before we get into this, again, I'm still really loving the actual format of this. I'm certainly going to be checking this out with songs that I don't particularly know, or I'm not particularly familiar with the history. I certainly want to have a check at these and learn more about them, because this has been really eye-opening. I had no idea, again, as I said, about this individual, and it is extremely significant as well, because multiple reasons, particularly one you said here, is it reminds us how personal war is, and this is something that I've said numerous times, and you're probably sick of hearing it, but I will continue to say this, is every war that has ever been fought in human history has been fought by people. And I know that sounds really stupid, but when you think of numbers, you know, when you're talking about casualties or numbers of armies, you know, in the hundreds of thousands, or the casualties in, you know, 15,000, you think of a number. But each of that 15,000 was a person. That person had his own story to tell, his own family, his own dreams, his own ambitions, his own kind of demons and his own things that he'd achieved that, you know, for some people nobody would ever recognize or remember him for, and yet he still deserved to be that. Remember that you deserve to be there, and that's something that I need to think about, or I think is important to think about. Is, again, as much as I absolutely adore this story of of this man. Again, it's important to say that, you know, he was the highest scoring kind of sniper of the First World War, 387, I think it was. But still, each of those 387 as well were people, and they probably had their own stories to tell. But I think getting away from that and talking about the kind of the individuality of war and the people who fight in it, it's significant as well to know this story because of where he became and where he went to. Because as I said, when he was born, he kind of had the worst roll of the dice that he probably could have, or won the worst. You know, he's born, as he said, like an undesirable, an orphan. He doesn't have his own parents. You know, he's taken away, raised by an adopted family, and lives his life kind of as a second-class citizen. He's not recognised as equal. And even when he goes away and fights in war, you know, in this kind of this hellish landscape, he still comes back and his service hasn't been recognised, or he hasn't, you know, been truly accepted by his own nation that he's shed blood for. And although it's not comparable, it's a similar thing that there was a big campaign over in my own country, Britain, with the Gurkha regiment. The Gurkhas, you know, if you're unfamiliar, just briefly, they're the soldiers from Nepal who for centuries now have worked alongside the British Army, served with the British Army. And there was a long thing that, despite them being deployed through numerous conflicts ranging from the Second World War onwards, you know, they were still not being granted citizenship. You know, technically, you know, it's not comparable because they're still Nepalese born. But the idea that they can go and shed blood for a nation and yet still not be welcomed as a citizen in that nation is ridiculous to me, to be honest. You know, I'm not going to talk about the kind of caste system within Canada with the First Nations and the reservations and things like that in that sense, because in modern times I feel like we should all agree that that shouldn't be a thing regardless. But that's how it was back then. It doesn't make it right, but that's how it was. But you know, just the idea that to a lesser extent some of those things are kind of almost happening now, where a government isn't necessarily rewarding or recognizing citizenship of people that have shed blood for that nation. That still fits really ill with me, and the fact that he was campaigning for this after the war in order to be recognized as that kind of equal footing is both an inspiration for his tenacity in order to do so, but also at the same time almost incredibly sad that he's gone through all of this, and yet despite having the physical fight, he needs to come home and has to actually fight again just to be recognised on that equal footing. Which, yeah, you know, as I said, when you're studying history, you're kind of supposed to remain kind of somewhat aloof to it, but it's still a shame when things like this happen. But yeah, let's see where they go, because I think they're about to talk to the band members. And I still don't know their names, so if somebody as well could help me out and say what their names are, and you know, any interesting background information about them, or know of a video where I can learn more about them individually, then I'd really look forward to that as well. But let's get into this.
Thanks, Indy. Thanks, Joachim. Yes, that's right. We are here in the trenches, in some actual World War I trenches. Joachim, over to you.
Well, at the end of every album production, when we're writing the lyrics and everything, there's always one or two songs left that we can't find the perfect story for. For us, it's really important that the music and the lyrics match.
That's cool.
And this song, really, we couldn't find anything until you came to our rescue.
Me?
Yes, we were actually a bit desperate.
Okay.
And we were scouring the internet. We came across an amazing episode on the Great War about Francis Pegahmagabow, a ghost in the trenches.
Of course, the hero of Ghost in the Trenches. Yeah, if you don't know, my first big YouTube series was The Great War. You should go and check it out. So, well, I'm glad I could be an inspiration to you guys.
Yes, it was lovely.
See, we work together. We complement each other. And now, back to you, Indy and Joachim. Thank you, roving reporters Indy Nidell and Joachim from Sabaton, and we are back in the studio. Okay, Ghost in the Trenches, Francis Pegahmagabow.
It was one of the first songs to be written for the album, actually the first one, and the first one featuring Tommy as a songwriter. So I wrote that with him.
Wow.
And this one, I actually started, I don't remember, it started with a Googling or something. And that's when I knew this is a song, because this is a, sorry for the language, what the fuck moment. How have I not heard about this? And I gotta say, you did a great job on the research, because what was available online, at least when I tried to find some, there wasn't much.
And cool that Tommy got the credit for that and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously he comes from bands where he's been the main songwriter and singer and keyboard player and guitarist at the same time.
Yeah.
So we already knew that he's perfectly capable of writing songs, but we didn't know if we were gonna be able to write songs together, because sometimes different songwriting styles don't really match. But in this case, I guess you'll be hearing more from me and Tommy.
And here's another bizarre little bonus. When we were filming the stuff at Verdun, I went down to the hotel bar, and Tommy was just playing on the piano and stuff. And there were a couple of journalists there, and they asked us to play a song together. And I don't know how it came up with this, but one of the journalists recorded it, so I guarantee we can put a piece of it here. This is me and Tommy doing Frosty the Snowman. completely unrehearsed. Tommy
Exclusive on Sabaton History.
Yeah.
Frosty the Snowman, it's a fairy tale they say. He was made of snow, but the children know how he came to life one day. There must have been some magic in that old silk hat they found, 'cause when they placed it on his head, he began to dance around.
All right, everyone. Remember to support us on Patreon, because that's what makes this show happen, actually. And there's a playlist. Cool shit. You want that. And also, don't forget to check out Time Ghost and World War II. And I hope to see you again very soon. Take care.
Okay, so that was Sabaton History. That's the first video that I've looked at from these guys, and I really enjoyed that, and I will be doing this forward, particularly with Sabaton songs in contexts that I don't actually quite know about or understand necessarily, so I'll definitely be doing that more. And I hope you guys enjoyed this. Please let me know if you kind of like me having a look at the Sabaton history and learning with you guys, because again, your feedback is obviously what helps me kind of decide what to do and kind of go forward and how to make things better, because I really want to make this better. I really actually quite enjoy doing this, and so any feedback that you can give me would be appreciated, along with any recommendations, like particularly the host, again, I need to remember his name, spoke about his Great War series of videos. Would you like me to check out that perhaps after Sabaton week, or at some point in the future having a check and going through his videos on the Great War? I don't know what they're about. Presumably from the gist, perhaps he goes through it chronologically, kind of, or some key events and goes through that. But yeah, if you know about it, then please let me know. And if you would like me to check it out, then obviously please let me know. But that was really cool, learning about this and understanding this. I kind of liked as well that they talked about the origin of the song as well, coming around after that. And I just want to end on this note that that's a really cool lamp. Like, that's a really cool lamp. But otherwise, I thank you ever so much for watching. This has been Sabaton History, A Ghost in the Trenches, the story of Francis Pegahmagabow. I will get there eventually. But he deserves to be remembered. A key individual that I didn't know about before watching this video. As always, the link to this video will be in the description. Please check out the Sabaton History and support them on Patreon. As they said, in order to do that show, they need that support, so please go help them. But otherwise, thank you ever so much for watching. I appreciate you spending time if you're still here, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thank you ever so much for watching. Bye bye.